So we're going to continue with looking at the central nervous system by looking at the spinal cord. In this part D, this slideshow, there are many slides that we're not going to cover, but they came with the textbook nonetheless. So we have said many times I will not be looking at the developmental aspects. So these are developmental aspects, but the spinal cord develops very early. It really is the part of the central nervous system that is in the spinal column. So it starts at the foramen magnum, which is the, as you know, the large hole in the base of the skull in the occipital bone, and it extends all the way down to the upper part of your low back at the level of the L1 vertebrae, the first lumbar vertebrae. And it ends in kind of a cone called the conus medullaris. There are nerves that exit the spinal cord that carry on beyond that, called the cauda equina, but we'll leave that for a moment. So what the spinal cord is primarily a communication cable, a network of nerves that, or of neural tracts that help the brain communicate with the periphery. So sensory neurons come in from the periphery to the spinal cord and then ascend up to the brain, where the brain processes things. The brain's motor cortex communicates with the periphery by sending signals down the descending pathways of the spinal cord and out to the periphery via the lower motor neurons. There is also an integration part of the spinal cord. There's some gray matter that are involved with reflex action, and we call those the spinal reflexes, things like the knee-jerk reflex, etc. So it's protected in the same way as the central nervous system, with an outer layer of bone that surrounds it, which in this case would be the spinal cord. There are the meninges with the same the same three levels: a dura mater, a pia mater, and an arachnoid mater in between. There's the cerebral spinal fluid flows down the center and then up in the subarachnoid space around the meninges, so the whole spinal cord is kind of cushioned in the cerebral spinal fluid as well as nourished by it. There is a layer of fat and blood vessels between the bone and the dura mater. It's called the epidural space. This is where you've heard of epidurals. This is where that takes place. There are little ligaments that secure the spinal cord to the dura mater. And there is a large ligament that goes from the conus all the way down to the coccyx. So it prevents the spinal cord from riding up. It gives it long axis tension. It's called the filum terminale, which means the end string. When we look down here, where it's showing, this picture is showing, giving the lumbar puncture. This is happening down below the level of where the spinal cord is, because it's much safer to do it there. There's nerves there, but there's not the spinal cord itself. You'll see that the green is the phylum terminale. It is not. It's a connective tissue, a supportive tissue. Okay, so if we look at it, the first thing that you'll notice is that it is fairly narrow and then gets wide almost immediately in the cervical region. It's called the cervical enlargement. Then through the thoracic region, it narrows again, and then the lumbar region, it widens out again. It ends here at the level of L1 in the conus, and then continues down in this stringy fashion, and that's called the cauda equina, which means the horse's tail, because that's what it looks like. Now the two enlargements, the cervical enlargement is where the nerve roots all come off for the upper limb, and the lumbar enlargement is where all the nerve roots come off for the lower limb. So your entire arm has nerves that originate in this area, and your entire lower limb has that originate in this area. There's 31 nerves that come off this spinal cord. They come off at every level, at the level of each vertebrae. So it comes off at the spaces between. So there are actually 8 in the cervical region, 12 in the thoracic, 5 in the lumbars, 5 in the coccyx, or in the sacrum, and 1 in the coccyx. So that's the 31 pairs. And I've already talked about the enlargements and the cauda equina. There is 2 grooves that almost divided into kind of hemispheres. There's the one on the front is the ventral median fissure, and the one on the back is the dorsal median fissure, sulcus, rather. And the gray matter is actually in the center. So when we look at it, it kind of has the gray matter, the unmyelinated stuff, kind of has this butterfly look surrounding that central canal here. So these are the fissures in sulcus here. You'll see that the nerves come off here and here. This is called the dorsal ramus. This is called the ventral ramus. It's all surrounded with the meninges. So there's a dura mater out here. There is a pia mater actually on the surface of the spinal cord. There is an arachnoid mater between. There's a space between the pia and the arachnoid called the subarachnoid space. There's the space between the dura and the arachnoid is the subdural space, and then the space outside of the dura is the epidural space. Completely surrounded by the arch of bone, the vertebral arch, in each vertebrae. This is obviously a cervical vertebrae. It's got the transverse foramen and the bifid spinous process here. This is more of a vertical look at it. So the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, the pia mater is right against it. These are the nerve roots. This is the ventral nerve root. This is the dorsal nerve root. And on the dorsal nerve root, we're going to see that there is an enlargement with some cell bodies. That's called the dorsal root ganglion. That will come into play later. Quite important, actually. The white matter surrounds the outside of the spinal cord. The gray matter is on the inside. You'll notice that the gray matter has got some points on it. This one that goes back is the dorsal horn. This one that goes forward is the ventral horn, and the one that goes sideways is the lateral horn. And it virtually divides the white matter into different areas. So there's the dorsal funiculus, the ventral funiculus, and the lateral funiculus. Again, it will come to be more important in later when we talk about the peripheral nervous system. So what happens in the gray matter is this is where processing happens. This is interneurons. This is where connections happen that make the reflexes. So the dorsal horn has got the area that receives the sensory input from both somatic and visceral areas. The ventral horns are where we find the cell bodies of the motor neurons, the somatic motor neurons. And so it's involved with the efferent output of the spinal cord. The lateral horns we don't find in the neck. We only find them in the thoracic and lumbar region. And this is where we get the neurons for the sympathetic nervous system. This is the place where all of the sympathetic fibers start. As I mentioned before, there is a dorsal root ganglion, and this is where the cell bodies of all the sensory nerves are found. So when we look at it, it looks like this, that all sensation, no matter where it comes from the body, ends up coming along a peripheral nerve, and then when it gets to this point, all the sensory neurons end up going up that dorsal root. And the cell bodies, since these are all unipolar cells, the sensory neurons are unipolar, the cell bodies are found in the dorsal root ganglion. The motor neurons all have their cell bodies here in the ventral horn of the gray matter, and they go out to the body via the ventral root and out the peripheral nerve that way. Now, the interneurons are these little neurons in here that join the two. If it's a reflex, they will join the two. The interneurons will cross over or go out to the white matter, which carries signals up to the brain or down from the brain. So the interneurons here, these blue ones up here, are from the somatosensory. So this would be like proprioceptors of your joints. The green ones here are visceral sensory. So this would be like baroreceptors and stuff from the digestive system or the circulatory system, that kind of thing. The visceral motor neurons are here, and they tend to be from the spinal cord area sympathetics. The parasympathetics are all manifested by cranial nerves. The somatomotor all is in this horn here, which is the ventral horn. So it's a very simple architecture, actually, and it makes sense that the interneurons start where the sensories come in, because they take information from the sensories. The motor neurons are found where they're going to exit on the ventral side. This explains a number of things. For instance, if you say you get into a snowboarding accident and you can't feel your foot, or you can't feel your leg, what they'll do in Emerge is ask you to wiggle your toes. Because if you can wiggle your toes, that means that the spinal cord is working on the motor side. It's the sensory side that's damaged. So you probably only have a bruise right here. If you can't wiggle your toes, then the damage goes right through the spinal cord to the ventral side, and it's a much more serious injury. Um, so the white matter is really the ascending tracts, the sensory tracts that go up to the brain, and the descending tracts that come from the brain into the periphery. So those would be the motor tracts. There are a few commissural tracts that cross from one side to the other, but mostly it's ascending and descending, sensory and motor tracts. And they're arranged in a way that would make a certain amount of sense, and they are named in by where they start and where they end. So the three white columns are the funiculi. I've already mentioned them: the dorsal ones on the posterior, the lateral ones, and the ventral ones. And they all kind of work as tracts, so they kind of all go to the same sort of area. They ascend and then they cross over, or they descend and they cross over, so that the right side of the brain is in contact with the left side of the body. We've already discussed that. There's usually some sort of relaying. There's more than one neuron in each pathway, and they're mirrored left to right. So if we look at it here, all the blue ones are ascending pathways. They go from the periphery to the brain. And when you consider that all of the input comes into here, it makes sense that input comes to here, and then these cells connect to these cells. They go up to the brain. So the sensory are all in the posterior, all of the posterior, and a lot of the kind of the posterior lateral are ascending tracts. And you'll see that the spinothalamic tract, like this one, goes from the spine to the thalamus. The lateral spinothalamic goes from the spine to the thalamus. The spinocerebellar here goes from the spine up to the cerebellum, etc. So these ones here on the lateral side are all about the cerebellum, which compares what your intention is to what's actually happening. So that's carried in here. These are the straight sensory pathways, the sense of touch, pain, etc., happen up in here. Now the red ones are all descending pathways. They come from the brain and they come down. So the corticospinal tract here comes from the cerebral cortex, from the motor cortex to here. The reticulospinal tract comes from the reticular. It's involved with the RAS. This comes from the red nucleus, the reverse-spinal. This one, vestibulospinal, is involved with balance and maintaining your balance. So this is a postural thing here. So I'm not expecting you to know these or be able to identify them. What I want you to see is that the posterior part of the spine is all ascending tracts. The anterior part of the spine is virtually all descending tracts, and laterally it's both. It's kind of a mix of both. So I'm not going to worry about the first order neurons, second order neurons, and the third order neurons. But basically what happens here is that the spinal nerves come in and they conduct. So these would be the peripheral nerves. So these are the neurons that come from the receptors in the skin or wherever, and they come to the spinal cord, first order. The second order are interneurons. So the cell body is in the dorsal horn, and then it goes up the ascending pathways and it goes either to the thalamus or the cerebellum. The third order ones, the cell body's in the thalamus, and then the axon goes all the way up into the somatosensory cortex, into the post-central gyrus. And you can see that how this pathway is going to work. So, and you can also see that a problem with the peripheral nerve, a problem with the spinal cord nerve, or a problem with the thalamus will all end up in a loss of sensation. I'm not so worried about the rest of the pathways. If you want to read them, feel free. You know, this looks at them in great detail where they cross over, etc., and how they react at multi levels. We're going to see that that it reacts this way and allows for spinal reflexes. Similarly, the descending pathways, so if we just go down here, have either direct or indirect ways of going, but there's always two neurons. There's an upper motor neuron, which basically the cells are up in the motor cortex, and the lower motor neurons, the cell bodies, are in the ventral horn of the spinal cord at the level in which the nerve leaves. So we're going to see later, and you're going to see in pathology, upper motor neuron lesions and lower motor neuron lesions. Upper motor neuron lesions are problems of motor coordination because of something gone wrong in the brain, so things like cerebral palsy, that kind of thing. Lower motor neuron lesions are usually either spinal cord or peripheral injuries. The rest of these slides, the next 12 slides in this presentation, are really more detailed than you need, or they are pathologies like Lou Gehrig's disease and such, which is not considered part of this course. So that's it.